They told him the war was over for him, that his next stop would be a prison camp or a firing squad. Instead, the Americans walked him across the tarmac and handed him the controls of their deadliest fighter. A German Luftwaffe pilot, sitting inside an American P-51 Mustang, the same aircraft that had hunted his comrades and helped destroy his air force in the skies over Europe. Forced, he wasn't threatened, he volunteered. And what happened next was so sensitive, the Pentagon buried it for more than 30 years. Because this story doesn't just challenge what we think we know about World War II. It forces us to ask a far more uncomfortable question. Survival, loyalty, and professional honor collide. What would you choose? December 1944. The sky over Germany no longer belongs to the Luftwaffe. What had once been the most feared air force in Europe is now being hunted daily, methodically, without mercy. American bombers cross the Reich in daylight, unchallenged for hours at a time. Long-range escorts, especially the North American P-51 Mustang, roam freely, waiting for the few remaining German fighters, foolish or desperate enough to rise and meet them. Is scarce. Pilots are scarcer. Training has collapsed. Young replacements arrive with barely 10 flight hours before being sent into combat. Veterans watch them die within days. Yet, hidden within the wreckage of Germany's collapsing air power, there are still a handful of men whose skill sets place them in a different category altogether. Pilots. Not aces chasing kill counts, but engineers in flight suits, men trusted to push aircraft beyond their limits, to identify flaws before they kill production pilots, to fly machines that officially do not exist. Among them is Hans, a Luftwaffe test pilot who has survived the entire war not by luck, but by mastery. The early 1,930 seconds, he has flown everything Germany dared to build. Frontline fighters, experimental variants, and most importantly, the Reich's most guarded secret, the jet-powered Messerschmitt Me 262. He understands German aircraft not just as weapons, but as systems, their strengths, their shortcuts, their compromises. In late 1944, he also understands something far more dangerous. Germany is finished. Last gamble, the Battle of the Bulge, has burned through the last strategic reserves of fuel, pilots, and credibility. The Luftwaffe no longer fights to win, it fights to delay the inevitable. December 14th, Hans is airborne on what should be a routine test flight, not combat, not interception, a performance evaluation of a modified Messerschmitt Bf 109, an aircraft already obsolete against Allied fighters, but still forced into service by necessity. Engine fails. Rushed manufacturing, or inferior late-war materials, the result is the same. The propeller dies. The aircraft becomes a glider. Below him lies enemy territory. Hans has options. Risk a crash landing in Germany and face the Gestapo, who treat failure as treason, bail out over collapsing front lines and be captured by advancing Soviet forces, or attempt something no German pilot of his stature has ever done voluntarily. Behind American lines. It is calculation. He knows the Americans follow the Geneva Convention. He knows their prisoner handling procedures. And more importantly, he knows something else. The Americans value information over vengeance. He brings the aircraft down. It is controlled, deliberate, almost professional. American soldiers arrive expecting wreckage and a dead pilot. Instead, they find a nearly intact German aircraft, and inside it, one of the most experienced test pilots in the Luftwaffe, alive, calm, and cooperative. Standard procedure begins immediately. Interrogation, identification, transferred to a prisoner of war facility. The moment intelligence officers realize who they are dealing with, the rules change. Because this is not just a pilot. He understands every German aircraft the Allies have struggled to counter. A man who knows why German engineers made the choices they did. A man who can explain not just how German fighters fly, but why they behave the way they do in combat. In days, Hans is no longer sitting across from infantry interrogators. He is flown to Wright Field, the nerve center of American flight testing and captured aircraft evaluation. For him there is a man who immediately understands the magnitude of what has just fallen into American hands. Harold Watson, one of the U.S. Army Air Force's most respected test pilots. Watson has spent years flying captured German aircraft, trying to understand them from the outside. Now, sitting across the table from him is perhaps the only man alive who understands them from the inside. What begins as a routine interrogation quietly transforms into something far more dangerous. A conversation between equals. At Wright Field, nothing about Hans's presence makes sense. By regulation, he is still an enemy prisoner of war. By reality, he is sitting in rooms where classified blueprints are discussed openly. Initial interrogation is supposed to last 72 hours. It stretches into weeks. It is simple. Hans does not talk like a captive. He talks like a colleague. When American intelligence officers ask how German fighters perform, Hans doesn't recite memorized specifications. He explains why they behave the way they do, why certain wings stall violently, why some engines tolerate abuse and others don't, why German aircraft feel deadly at first contact and fragile over time. Sitting across from him, asking the questions, is a man uniquely qualified to understand what he's hearing, Harold Watson. He isn't a desk officer. He is a test pilot, one of the best the Americans have. For years, Watson has flown captured German aircraft under the program later known as Operation Lusty. He has studied them in isolation, pushing them through envelopes, documenting their strengths and failures. Something has always been missing. The American pilots know what German aircraft do. Hans knows why they were built that way. Their conversations drift far beyond interrogation checklists. They talk about design compromises, production shortcuts, pilot workload, maintenance realities at the end of the war. Hans explains how German engineers prioritized peak performance, even if it shortened engine life, because they believed air battles would be brief and decisive. Watson realizes something unsettling. Not just because their aircraft are good, but because American engineers made fundamentally different choices. Ability over brilliance, consistency over perfection, endurance over peak performance. Evening, after another long technical discussion, Watson has a thought he immediately knows is dangerous. If understanding German aircraft from the inside isn't enough, what if the real advantage would come from seeing American aircraft through German eyes? The idea is absurd, possibly illegal, definitely career-ending if mishandled. Letting a Luftwaffe test pilot fly American fighters would violate nearly every security doctrine the U.S. Army Air Forces have. Watson also understands something else. In combat, he already knows how they fight. What he doesn't know, what no German pilot has ever experienced, is how they feel from inside the cockpit. Watson brings the idea to his superiors. And unanimous. Absolutely not. American aircraft designs are classified. Allowing an enemy pilot access, even limited access, risks sabotage, escape, or intelligence leaks that could cost lives. Watson refuses to let the idea die. Being asked to design weapons, he isn't being given blueprints. He would only fly aircraft the Germans have already faced in battle. Every flight could be monitored, every control modified. Escape made impossible. It climbs the chain of command, from Wright Field to Washington, all the way to the Pentagon. For 23 days, the proposal sits on desks marked restricted. Men who have never met Hans argue about him as an abstract risk. Traitor, the victor, a priceless asset, a security nightmare. Finally, a decision comes down. Extraordinary conditions. Remain a prisoner of war. He will be guarded at all times. Every aircraft will be modified. Every flight recorded. And most importantly, must agree voluntarily. That's no promises of freedom. Watson presents the offer. Hans does not answer immediately. For nearly 10 minutes, he says nothing. Where survival turns into choice. And he actively helps the enemy defeat what remains of his country. Refuse, and he disappears into a prisoner camp, his knowledge locked away, his career over. Hans finally speaks. He doesn't say yes. He says, the war quietly enters a space no one had planned for, a place where loyalty, professionalism, and survival are no longer cleanly separated. March 15th, 1945. Morning fog hangs low over Wright Field. Far side of the airfield, a single fighter sits waiting on the tarmac. Its shape is instantly recognizable to every man present. Aircraft that broke the back of the Luftwaffe. The escort fighter that turned daylight bombing from suicide into routine. The American P-51 Mustang. Flanked by armed guards. Not because he might escape, but because protocol demands the appearance of control. And watching, the moment feels unreal. Being evaluated by Americans. This is the reverse. Luftwaffe test pilot until recently considered an enemy of the highest order about to climb into the cockpit of America's most lethal fighter. Stops beneath the wing. Metal skin. Not reverently, professionally. Differences are immediate. German aircraft are built tight, almost fragile, pushed to the edge of physics, every gram shaved, every component stressed to its limit. They are brilliant machines that demand constant care. Mustang feels different. Starts the engine. The access panels are larger. The fasteners standardized. The cockpit layout clean, logical, forgiving. The aircraft was not built just to fly well. It was built to be flown every day by thousands of pilots in all conditions. Crews finish their checks. Watson watches from a safe distance, pretending calm. If this goes wrong, careers end. If it goes very wrong, history never hears about this moment at all. Hans climbs into the cockpit. Immediately, the controls fall naturally to hand. He scans the instruments and freezes. Advanced, then German instruments. They are clearer. Harder to read, harder to misinterpret under stress. The engine start sequence is almost insultingly simple. No ritualistic coaxing of a temperamental power plant. Packard V-1650 Merlin comes alive smoothly, confidently, like it expects to survive. Taxis out. For the first time since the war began, a German Luftwaffe pilot advances the throttle of an American fighter. The Mustang surges forward. Pushes him back into the seat harder than he expects, not violent, but relentless. There is no sense of strain, no vibration begging him to ease off. Rotation speed, the aircraft lifts cleanly, obediently, as if it has done this 1,000 times already. It has. He tests the controls gently at first. Roll, pitch, yaw. Everything is responsive, but stable. The aircraft does not punish minor errors. It absorbs them. Altitude, he pushes harder. Climbs under full power. Energy retention tests that would have shaken a late-war German fighter apart. Mustang just keeps going. Hans begins to understand something that terrifies him. Pilots were trained to fight short, violent battles. Intercept, fire, disengage. American pilots were trained to stay. Endurance, fuel range, pilot comfort, mechanical reliability. It allows its pilot to remain in the fight long after German fighters must turn back or risk dead stick landings. Hours later, Hans lands. No one speaks at first. Watson asks the question everyone is holding back. Well? Smile. He does not exaggerate. He says simply, solved problems we didn't even know we had. Over the following weeks, Hans flies more American aircraft. 47 Thunderbolt, built like a flying anvil, the elegant but demanding Lockheed P-38 Lightning, even early jet prototypes, including the Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star. Flight confirms the same conclusion. Builds the best aircraft. It is winning because it builds aircraft that survive reality. Hans puts it bluntly in his reports. Planes, he tells Watson, you build planes better. With every flight, a darker realization settles in. If German high command had truly understood what American industry was producing, how reliably, how consistently, how at scale, they would have known the war was already lost. Like a German officer, thinking like a test pilot. Truth can exist beyond flags and uniforms will soon follow him long after the war itself ends. By April 1945, the guards around Hans are still there, but they matter less than before. One at Wright Field says it out loud. Yet everyone understands the truth. Hans is no longer being watched for what he might do. He is being listened to for what he sees. American test pilots begin to trust him not emotionally, but professionally. And in their world, that matters more. Each flight, Hans sits with engineers and pilots in briefing rooms filled with chalkboards and cigarette smoke. There are no ideological arguments, no politics, only data. He speaks plainly. Trying to win the first 5 minutes of a fight, American aircraft were designed to survive the next 2 hours. The doctrine assumed pilots would be lost quickly, so machines were pushed to extremes. Engines ran hot, airframes aged fast, maintenance was sacrificed for performance. America made the opposite bet. Could survive in? Build engines that could be abused. Build systems that forgave mistakes. This does not praise America. He diagnoses Germany, and in doing so, he dismantles years of Nazi propaganda without ever mentioning ideology. The American pilots, many of whom lost friends to German fighters, struggle at first with the contradiction. This man flew for the enemy. His aircraft killed Americans. Every time he climbs into a cockpit, every time he files a report, he proves something difficult to dismiss. Honest even when the truth flatters no one. Expected happens. Conversations stretch beyond aircraft. They talk about flight testing philosophy, about fear, about responsibility, about how a pilot lives with the knowledge that machines fail and when they do, men die. admits something he has never said before. He no longer believed Germany could win. He only believed aircraft deserved to be understood honestly. Colonel Harold Watson later writes that he expected to interrogate a fanatic. Instead, he found a professional who treated truth as a duty. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrenders. Celebrations erupt across Allied bases. Mood is different. The war is over, but Hans's position is now more complicated than ever. But he has no country to return to. His aviation industry has been dismantled, its air force abolished, its test pilots, men like Hans, have no future there. Americans have a new problem forming. Reports from Europe and Asia point to a new rival, the Soviet Union. Aircraft designs no one fully understands yet. Jet technology accelerating faster than anyone predicted. Hans, who has flown against Soviet aircraft, who understands Eastern and Western doctrine, suddenly becomes more valuable in peace than he ever was in war. The decision that follows would have been unthinkable just months earlier. The U.S. Army Air Forces offer Hans a civilian contract. Not as a prisoner, not as an informant, but as a test pilot. Some officers protest. Former enemies should not be trusted with America's future. Watson argues back. He's chosen truth over flags, he writes. If we reject him now, we lose more than we gain. December 1945, exactly 1 year after his capture, Hans accepts. He will fly for the United States. Hans works as an American test pilot until 1950. In those 5 years, he flies nearly every major U.S. aircraft entering service. His feedback shapes training manuals. His insights influence design philosophy. His experience helps American pilots prepare for conflicts that have not yet been named: Korea, Vietnam, beyond. Most explosive truth is still hidden. For 33 years, the 8 classified files are finally opened. And the story changes. Failure in December 1944 was not an accident. Declassified German maintenance records reveal that he sabotaged his own aircraft. Carefully, deliberately, without harming civilians. It's by chance. Chose them. From the beginning, Hans was not captured because it revealed something dangerous. That loyalty in modern war is not always ideological, it can be professional. This was not an isolated case. His program became the blueprint for Operation Paperclip, the effort that brought hundreds of German engineers, scientists, and aviation experts into the United States after the war. Who would shape rockets, jets, and the Cold War itself. Hans eventually returns to Germany, helping rebuild its aviation industry. He remains respected on both sides of the Atlantic. He dies in 1997. American and German pilots attend his memorial. Some call him a traitor, others call him a professional. They offer no verdict. They offer a question. Is collapsing, your cause corrupted, and your skills could save lives instead of ending them? Do you owe loyalty to a flag or to the truth? That's why this story stayed buried. But because it forces us to confront something uncomfortable. In the most destructive war in history, professional integrity and human respect sometimes mattered more than sides. That may be the most dangerous lesson of all. Wars are usually remembered through clean moral frames, heroes and villains, loyalty and betrayal, victory and defeat. But the story of Hans, a Luftwaffe test pilot who ended the war flying American aircraft, refuses to fit into those frames, and that is precisely why it remained buried for decades. This story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about modern industrial warfare. Professional competence does not always align with ideological loyalty. In fact, the two can come into direct conflict. Hans was not a political defector in the traditional sense. He did not abandon Germany because he suddenly embraced American values or rejected his culture. He defected because the system he served had stopped valuing truth. By late 1944, Nazi Germany was no longer interested in whether aircraft worked as designed, whether pilots survived missions, or whether engineering decisions made sense. It was interested only in appearances of resistance, of sacrifice, of obedience. Test pilot. This was an ethical dead end. Test pilots exist at the boundary between theory and reality. Their duty is not to ideology, morale, or propaganda. Their duty is to physics, to limits, to failure modes. When a test pilot says an aircraft is unsafe, ignoring that warning does not create courage, it creates funerals. Hans understood this more clearly than most, because he had flown Germany's most advanced machines, including jets that were rushed into service without adequate testing, flown by undertrained pilots, and supported by collapsing logistics. Final months of the war. Hans knew something that Germany's leadership refused to accept. The war was already lost, not tactically, but structurally. American victory was not the result of a single aircraft, or a single battle, or even a single strategy. It was the result of a system that valued reliability over brilliance, endurance over peak performance, and truth over prestige. American aircraft confirmed this in ways no intelligence report ever could. Inside the cockpit of a P-51 Mustang, Hans did not discover superior genius. He discovered superior priorities. The aircraft was not designed to be perfect in a laboratory sense. It was designed to work every day, in bad weather, with average pilots, under stress. Its systems were forgiving. Its maintenance was standardized. Its engine was expected to survive abuse, not just optimal conditions. It revealed the deepest asymmetry of the war. Germany built aircraft for heroes. America built aircraft for reality. That difference shaped everything. Short, decisive engagements. American doctrine assumed long missions, repeated sorties, and pilot survival over time. German engineers optimized for performance peaks. American engineers optimized for production consistency. German industry relied on skilled labor and precision machining. American industry relied on scalability, redundancy, and tolerance. These differences were ideological in origin. They were professional choices. And those choices determined the outcome of the war long before the final battles were fought. His cooperation with the Americans was dangerous not because it helped defeat Germany. Germany was already defeated, but because it exposed these structural truths. If the public had known that an elite Luftwaffe test pilot voluntarily chose to fly American aircraft and then openly acknowledged their superiority in design philosophy, it would have undermined the myth that Germany lost only because of numbers or bad luck. It suggested something far more unsettling, that the system itself was flawed at its core. This is why the story matters beyond World War II. Just for intelligence gathering, but for a new model of post-war power. The United States did not simply defeat Germany militarily. It absorbed its expertise, filtered it through American systems, and redirected it toward future conflicts. Hans's work as a civilian test pilot fed directly into the early Cold War aviation mindset, where endurance, reliability, and human factors became dominant concerns. It was not about forgiveness. It was about utility. And that raises the most difficult question of all. Was Hans a traitor, or was he a professional? The answer depends entirely on what we believe loyalty should mean in extreme circumstances. If loyalty means obedience to a collapsing regime, regardless of consequence, then Hans betrayed Germany. But if loyalty means fidelity to truth, safety, and professional responsibility, then Hans acted consistently with the highest standards of his craft. Modern warfare increasingly creates this dilemma. As conflicts become more technological, more automated, and more complex, the gap between political goals and technical reality widens. Engineers, pilots, scientists, and operators are often placed in positions where following orders means knowingly producing failure, waste, or unnecessary death. Hans's story suggests that at some point, professional integrity becomes a form of resistance. Ideological resistance. Practical resistance. The Pentagon understood how destabilizing this idea was. That is why the story remained classified for 33 years. Not because it revealed secrets about aircraft performance, but because it challenged a comforting illusion that wars are fought solely by patriots and fanatics rather than by professionals navigating collapsing systems. Hans did not win the war for the Americans, but he helped them understand why they had already won. And in doing so, he demonstrated something that remains deeply relevant today. In war, the side that values truth sooner wins, not because it is morally superior, but because reality eventually enforces its rules. The real lesson of this story. Not redemption, not betrayal, but the quiet, dangerous power of professional honesty in a world built on illusions. May be why history tried so hard to forget it. That discomfort is not accidental. Stories like Hans's threaten the way nations prefer to remember war. They blur the line between victory and virtue, between defeat and failure. They suggest that wars are not decided solely by courage or sacrifice, but by systems that reward truth early and punish it late. What makes Hans's case especially unsettling is that nothing about his decision was dramatic in the traditional sense. There was no speech, no manifesto, no ideological conversion. His defection was quiet, technical, almost bureaucratic. He sabotaged his aircraft carefully. He chose his landing site deliberately. He cooperated under conditions that preserved his professional boundaries. At every step, he behaved not like a rebel, but like a man continuing his job under new constraints. Is precisely why the story matters. Are not created by villains who know they are wrong. They are created by institutions that no longer care whether they are right. Late war Germany did not collapse because its people lacked courage. It collapsed because its decision-making system had become incapable of absorbing bad news. Aircraft that failed were still ordered into service. Pilots who lacked training were still sent aloft. Engineers who raised objections were ignored or punished. Hans stood at the intersection of those failures. As a test pilot, his role was to be the messenger of inconvenient reality. When that role became meaningless inside the system he served, his only remaining choice was whether to continue participating in a lie. By choosing to defect, Hans was not choosing America over Germany. He was choosing reality over illusion. Distinction is crucial because it reframes the moral question entirely. History often asks whether individuals should sacrifice themselves for their nation. Hans's story asks a harder question. What if sacrificing yourself no longer serves your nation at all? What if it only serves the preservation of false narratives, sunk costs, and institutional pride? The American response to Hans reveals another uncomfortable truth. The United States did not accept him out of moral generosity. It accepted him because American military culture, particularly in aviation, was willing to separate ideology from function. The Pentagon's decision was cold, calculated, and pragmatic. Hans was useful because he told the truth clearly, consistently, and without self-interest. Pragmatism became a defining advantage of American power in the post-war world. Operation Paperclip, controversial as it remains, was not driven by forgiveness or admiration. It was driven by recognition that modern power depends on absorbing expertise faster than rivals can. Hans's case demonstrated that expertise does not carry moral alignment by default, but it does carry consequences if ignored. The Cold War that followed would be shaped by this lesson. Aircraft would be designed not just to outperform enemies, but to outlast systems. Pilot survivability, maintenance cycles, human factors engineering these priorities flowed directly from the realization that wars are won by repeatability, not moments of brilliance. He lived long enough to see this transformation play out. He watched jet aircraft become platforms rather than experiments. He saw testing culture evolve from hero-driven risk-taking to data-driven risk management. And he saw former enemies adopt similar professional languages even as they stood on opposite sides of geopolitical divides. In that sense, Hans was not an anomaly. He was an early signal of a new kind of warfare, one where the most decisive battles happen long before shots are fired, inside design offices, testing programs, and institutional cultures. This is why this story still resonates. Simpler since 1945, it has become more technical, more interdependent, and more fragile. The tension between loyalty and competence has only grown sharper. Engineers, operators, analysts, and specialists today face pressures strikingly similar to those Hans faced: pressures to conform, to simplify, to ignore inconvenient data. The story offers no easy moral instruction. It offers something more valuable: a warning. Systems that punish truth eventually collapse under their own weight. Systems that reward honesty, even when it is uncomfortable, adapt and survive. And Hans was not remembered because he switched sides. He was remembered because he understood something many never do. In modern war, and perhaps in modern life, the most dangerous enemy is not the other side, but the refusal to see reality clearly. That lesson, unlike aircraft specifications or classified reports, never truly expires. The danger of ignoring reality is not abstract. It has a measurable cost, and history records it in lives, not theories. Germany provides one of the clearest case studies of what happens when systems collapse inward. By 1944, the Luftwaffe still possessed remarkable machines on paper, advanced aerodynamics, early jet propulsion, innovative weaponry, but these capabilities existed in isolation. They were not supported by fuel supply, pilot training pipelines, maintenance infrastructure, or production consistency. The system had become fragmented, optimized for symbolic breakthroughs rather than operational sustainability. He saw this fragmentation from the inside. Exposed to the raw edge of technological ambition, he flew aircraft that promised revolutionary performance but arrived riddled with compromises, engines that required constant attention, airframes intolerant of damage, control systems that punished small errors. These were not flaws of incompetence. They were the logical outcome of a culture that valued peak performance as proof of superiority, even when that performance could not be maintained in real combat conditions. What made the situation fatal was not that these problems existed, but that the system refused to acknowledge them. As pilots reported failures, leadership interpreted criticism as disloyalty. When engineers warned of limits, they were overruled by political urgency. When production quality declined, the response was not correction but acceleration. The result was a feedback loop, where reality was increasingly excluded from decision-making. This is the moment when professional integrity becomes dangerous. In healthy systems, professionals serve as corrective mechanisms. They surface problems early, absorb blame, and adjust processes. In unhealthy systems, professionals become threats. Their knowledge contradicts official narratives. Their warnings imply accountability. Their existence exposes the gap between appearance and function. This defection cannot be understood without this context. He did not leave Germany because he stopped being German. He left because the role he occupied, the role of truth-teller, had become incompatible with survival inside the system. Continuing to serve meant participating in a lie that would kill pilots and achieve nothing. Leaving was not an act of rebellion. It was an act of withdrawal from a system that no longer accepted correction. The American system, by contrast, was far from perfect. It made mistakes, wasted resources, and misjudged enemies. But it retained one decisive advantage: the ability to absorb bad news without collapsing. The American test culture was built around failure analysis. Aircraft were expected to break. Pilots were expected to report discomfort. Engineers were expected to revise designs. None of this was glamorous. It did not produce revolutionary leaps as quickly as Germany's approach, but it produced something more powerful: repeatability. Repeatability is the hidden currency of modern warfare. An aircraft that performs at 90% every day is more valuable than one that performs at 110% once. A pilot who survives 10 missions is more valuable than one who achieves brilliance on a single sortie. A production line that delivers thousands of identical airframes is more decisive than a workshop producing masterpieces. He understood this the moment he flew American aircraft. What unsettled him was not that they were better in every metric, they were not, but that they were designed for the average case, not the ideal one. Controls were laid out for clarity. Maintenance access was simplified. Engines were overbuilt. Tolerances were forgiving. These were not aesthetic choices. They were philosophical ones. They reflected an acceptance of human limitation. This is where the moral dimension becomes unavoidable. Often demand transcendence. They ask individuals to exceed limits, to sacrifice safety, to become symbols rather than humans. Democratic industrial systems, for all their flaws, tend to optimize for survivability, not because they are more humane by nature, but because survivability sustains capacity. This experience revealed that the war was decided not by ideology, but by alignment with human reality. The Pentagon understood the implications immediately. Allowing this story into the public domain during the early Cold War would have complicated every narrative the United States relied on. It would have suggested that the enemy was not defeated purely by moral superiority or battlefield heroism, but by institutional design choices that rewarded honesty. The message cuts both ways. Systems rather than virtue, then no nation is immune to failure. Systems can degrade. Feedback loops can break. Truth can become inconvenient. Professionals can be sidelined. This is why Hans's story was dangerous, not because it absolved him, but because it implicated everyone. The decision to classify the story for decades was not about protecting secrets. It was about protecting comfort. It allowed the public to maintain a simplified memory of the war, while policymakers quietly internalized its real lessons. Lessons shaped the Cold War. 1945 increasingly emphasized pilot survivability, redundancy, and human factors. Jet programs incorporated extensive testing regimes. Failures were documented, not hidden. The goal was not invincibility, but resilience. This approach did not eliminate disasters, but it reduced their frequency and limited their scope. His influence, while impossible to quantify precisely, was symbolic of this shift. He represented the professional conscience of a defeated system being absorbed by a victorious one. Even this interpretation should not become mythologized. Hans was not a saint. He was not free of self-interest. He sought survival, relevance, and a future for his skills. But this does not diminish the significance of his choice. In fact, it reinforces it. Most consequential decisions are made under mixed motives, not pure ones. Matters is alignment.